Okay, looks like lots of people have joined us. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody, to a special Global Encounters and First Nations Peoples seminar. A little bit out of sequence, but I could not resist the opportunity knowing that our good friend and colleague Anja Schwarz was here in Naarm in Melbourne. Obviously, as I always do, I begin by saying that we are meeting on the unceded lands of Naarm, the home of the Wurrung Wurundjeri Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation. I'm Lynette Russell and I run Global Encounters and First Nations People. It is actually a real thrill tonight to have Anja speaking to us about something that she is revisiting because she visited it a few years ago, but now we've twisted her arm to think about it again. And that's about Tupaia, who, as many of you will know, one of the most extraordinary priests from Tahiti who went on to iātea and went on to join Cook and Cook's voyage, extraordinary stuff in the 1770. It's a powerful story. It's a powerful story that tells us a lot about the role of these kind of intermediary people who were really articulating global encounters in ways that we may never have thought of before. So it's my absolute pleasure to ask Anja to take over from here, share her slides, and tell us all about Tupaia's map of Oceania.
Thank you, Lynette. I will be sharing the slide and I need just a second to do that and then I'll get started.
And I shall turn off my camera, but I'm here.
Okay, that's not sharing the slide. Great.
Uh,
Already
no,
that's nope,
we're
nope,
not,
nope.
we're not sharing it yet. We're
Yeah, I
seeing the
know.
whole, yeah, that's okay.
I need to apologies. That's what happens, right? We practiced, of course. Hello,
Yeah, we
everyone.
did.
We practiced before you came
Good.
in, and now it, of course, goes wrong. I try once more and let's see. Yeah, I think now it's working.
Gotcha.
That's
All
good.
good.
Wonderful. Um, Thank you all for being here. I'm this is obviously on Zoom, and I could just as easily be speaking from my hometown, Berlin. But I feel incredibly fortunate to be in Naarm on the beautiful lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And like Lynette, I want to acknowledge their sovereignty and pay my respects. Um, I'm in a hotel room and the internet is stable, we realized, but not perfect. And I want to apologize also if there are any sort of sound issues or if the slides cannot be seen perfectly, but I hope it's going to be fine. Um, Lynette invited me to speak about Tupaia's map, drawing on work that I undertook together with my German colleague Lars Eckstein, and it was published in 2019. Now that's a while ago, and I felt it would be redundant simply to repeat what we argue in an article that's already published and that I'm briefly sharing the title of here in case you're interested or did not know about that. So I will talk about the map for sure, but I will try to also engage more thoroughly than I think Lars and I do in that piece with the theme of encounters. In fact, I returned to that theme twice in my talk. First, before discussing the map itself, I will sketch the broader context of European Tahitian encounters in the late 18th century from which the map emerged, along with the centrality of Tupaia to the knowledge about Tahiti that was brought back to Europe by the Endeavour. And second, I return to the theme of encounters at the end of my talk to ask what kind of relationships and obligations such encounters continue to engender in the present. But first, of course, I should just maybe remind all of us or tell all of us about Tupaia. There is no image of him. So I'm sharing this cover of the 2019 graphic novel by Sina Meredith and Matt Tate to give us a contemporary imagination of what he might have looked like. Tupaia was born around 1725 on iātea in the Society Islands. He came from a family of master navigators and was trained in sacred and navigational knowledge at Tapu Tapu Atea Marae, a key center of ritual history, and voyaging instruction in Eastern Polynesia. The intellectual world in which he was educated extended across vast distances, from Hawaii in the north to Aotearoa in the south, from Rapa Nui in the east, and possibly even as far as the Americas. This was not an isolated island culture, as Polynesian islands have often come to be represented these days, but part of an expansive, interconnected knowledge network sustained over centuries through genealogy, oral tradition, and navigation. Following political conflict and war with the neighboring island of Pora in the 1670s, Tupaia had to leave iātea and was exiled to Tahiti, where he attained significant social standing. He was present when the first Europeans arrived in 1767 and acted as a diplomat during those early encounters. So when James Cook and the crew of the Endeavour arrived in 1769, Tupaia made the decision to travel with them. A conventional narrative suggests that Joseph Banks invited him aboard, and that's certainly true, but this framing understates Tupaia's agency. Yes, he was a guest, but he was also a crucial actor, and his decision to come on board was strategic. His role later on the voyage in Aotearoa offers a powerful example of his crucial role on that voyage. Upon arrival, communication with Māori was essential but impossible for Cook's crew. They did not speak the language. In moments of tension and conflict, and there were quite a few, it was Tupaia who could speak, negotiate, and mediate. His linguistic and cultural knowledge and the deep respect that he was afforded by Māori was crucial in shaping those early encounters in Aotearoa. But his role on the voyage went far beyond diplomacy. The work that I have done on Tupaia and the work that Lars Eckstein and I have done on Tupaia has made me convinced that his knowledge was central to the understanding that was developed by the Endeavour's crew of almost every aspect of Tahitian life: political structures, religious practices, geography, and navigation. Yet his role in producing this knowledge largely disappeared from the record. When maps and reports of the Endeavour voyage were prepared for the Admiralty and when journals were redrafted for publication, the specialized information Tupaia had provided in 1769 was transformed from into seemingly objective facts. These were then attributed to the observational skills of Banks, Cook, and their officers, rather than to the indigenous expert who had made these observations possible, or these insights possible. The map I want to discuss. I'm sorry, I'm trying. I'm reading from the screen, as you can tell, so I'm struggling a bit with finding that. Yeah, here we go. The map I want to discuss emerged from a project initiated by Cook and his crew after leaving the Society Islands. Begun in August 1769 and completed in Aotearoa in February 1770, it represents Tupaia's attempt to translate his wayfinding knowledge of Oceania into a format that Europeans such as Cook could grasp. Let me stress from the beginning that this was not an easy task, because the practice as well as the epistemological underpinnings of European and Polynesian wayfinding and navigation differed considerably. And I would just point to some of these differences, really only a couple. European navigation and wayfinding in the late 18th century worked similar to how we think space works today, but not quite. But generally what we share, I think, with this kind of worldview still is that we have an idea of, when we look at a map, that we're somehow extracted from it, that we look at it from a God's eye view, if you like. And that below us is an abstracted world, fixed and flattened according to latitude and longitude. And we then position ourselves, we can position ourselves and we can position places on a grid, if you like. Navigation in such a that works with such a worldview relies on instruments. In Cook's day, that would have been the sextant and the compass and other instruments to establish a latitude, and then even more instruments to establish longitude. Polynesian navigation and wayfinding in the late 18th century was fundamentally different from this worldview in that it did not extract the voyager from the map, if you like, or from the world in which that was being traveled, but rather had the idea, and I think many of you will be familiar with this idea, that the Voyager is in the center of a world that can be configured according to where one wants to go. I think a kind of a metaphor for that kind of traveling that many know is this idea of fishing up islands, right? You stay put, but you can somehow fish up islands that move towards you as you know, when you're traveling towards that, when Europeans would think you would travel towards them, but rather in this world view, the island would come to you. You stay put. You're always at the center. It relies on astronomy. It relies on lots of other things, but really this idea of a traveler being in the center and then being able to configure the world around them is the key kind of difference that I would want to take forward. For a long time, the only known version of Tupaia's map was an engraving published in 1778 by a German naturalist called Johann Reinhold Forster and his son Georg Forster, who had traveled with Cook on the second voyage. The Forsters were interested in Tupaia, and so they had asked members of Cook's crew who were also traveling on the second voyage for information, and that's how come they were able to produce this map. But they were ambivalent about it. And this ambivalence was in fact characteristic of how the map was discussed until way into the 2000s. Johann Reinhold Forster, the father, described it as, and I'm quoting, a monument of the ingenuity and geographical knowledge of the people in the Society Islands and of Tupaia in particular. Yet elsewhere, his son, Georg Forster, and they actually always published together, but under a different name now, Georg Forster, questioned its accuracy, suggesting that Tupaia's vanity may have led him to invent islands. The Forster skepticism stemmed from the fact that the map that they produced did not conform to Western cartographic conventions. Islands did not appear where they should, according to the standards of latitude, longitude, and Mercator projection. This helps explain why Johann Reinhold Forster did not reproduce Tupaia's drafts as they were. Instead, he actually improved them. He added islands encountered on the second voyage. He imposed a grid of latitude and longitude centered on Greenwich, and he stretched island positions along the longitudinal axis to align the map with European conventions. So he had original drafts that I will talk about in a moment, but he improved them, and in doing so, he rendered Tupaia's original spatial logic effectively unreadable. Now, and this was the map, I just stress it again, that most scholars knew from the late 18th century right up until 1955. And that was sort of the basis of discussions around this Tupaia's map. Crucially, Tupaia's own map looked very different from this engraved version, and luckily we know more or less what it looked like. Forster, in producing this, noted that he had worked from two original drafts. One had belonged to Lieutenant Richard Pickersgill, and Lars Eckstein and I were able to find a copy of it in a city archive in the German town of Brunswick, preserved in a letter by Georg Forster sent to his publisher. So we have here the map that's in that German archive, and it's a lesser known version of Tupaia's map. The other draft, owned by Joseph Banks, was also loaned to Forster, and for a long time, the Forster's engraving nevertheless remained the only known version until Ernest Bigerhol rediscovered this copy in 1955 amongst Banks' papers. And since then, as I assume many of you know, this particular version of Tupaia's map has played a key role in Oceanian Renaissance and continues to shape debates about Polynesian voyaging and navigation. But even with this map, the problem remained. The map still appears unreadable, at least when approached through Western cartographic conventions. That is, even when people began to agree that the map was indeed an indication of Tupaia's vast knowledge of the Sea of Islands, the map itself was considered unreadable and understood as the product of an epistemic clash. European latitude, longitude cartography and Polynesian wayfinding overlaid without reconciliation, seemingly cancelling each other out. In the article that we published in 2019, Lars Eckstein and I argue, however, that what we see is not a failed hybrid or a simple collision, but a complex act of translation, one that was designed to be and that can, in fact, be deciphered, or rather step-by-step reconstructed. And that's what we do in that article, and that I would take you through some of that today. However, I want to depart from a narrative strictly focused on the map for a moment. Before turning to what we believe to have sort of found out about the map, I would like to linger a little longer on the broader question of what can be communicated during encounters across cultural and epistemological difference. Because when you think about it, not only the map, but virtually all the insights the Endeavour's crew claimed to have gained about Tahitian life are something of a puzzle. The ship spent only 2 months in the Society Islands, and we know from language lists that people kept how incredibly limited the crew's knowledge of Tahitian remained during this time. And we don't quite know how much English Tahitians spoke, but we might imagine a similarly limited vocabulary. Yet Joseph Banks, for example, was able to return to Britain with remarkably detailed descriptions of highly specialized religious practices and their meaning in his manners and customs of the South Sea Islands. His knowledge is so specific and seemingly authoritative that some of his contemporaries asked how it could have been acquired in such a short time. After all, as the Scottish writer James Boswell noted, for example, following a conversation with Cook, and I'm quoting Boswell here, their knowledge of the language was so imperfect that they required the aid of their senses, and anything they learned about religion, government, or traditions might be quite wrong. The question then is obvious. How was such detailed knowledge possible? And how, across linguistic and cultural difference, was it communicated? I want to, in this context, talk about the drawings attributed to Tupaia now held in the British Library. I think, and that has been my work in the past years, some of my work in the past years, I think that they offer important insights into this and into Tupaia's role aboard the Endeavour. Focusing on them allows me to illustrate more clearly the extent and specific form that knowledge exchange took during these months, really, these 2 months. For many years, these drawings were mistakenly attributed to Joseph Banks. I think many will know this, and it's quite funny when you think that Joseph Banks was someone with a classical training in drawing, as he would have had. It's quite. I think it's still sort of funny that they were attributed to him. But scholars assumed they were quick sketches by a European observer attempting to document unfamiliar scenes. That assumption seemed plausible, not least because of the striking correspondence between the images and especially Banks's descriptions in his journals. This interpretation shifted in the 1990s when a historian revisited a letter in which Banks explicitly stated that a particular image, and that's the one that's been on the screen for a while now, depicted him exchanging tapa for crayfish with the Māori chief. And it said in that letter by Banks that it had been drawn by Tupaia. And once that attribution was recognized, the entire corpus of drawings then had to be reconsidered. Two sort of questions then follow. First, why would Banks and his draftsmen give Tupaia access to precious paper and pigment, color, scarce materials on this long voyage, usually reserved for scientific documentation? And second, why did Tupaia draw, and why did he do so in a European style? One common explanation is that Tupaia simply wished to learn European style representation, and he's often praised actually for how quickly he mastered it, or he must have mastered it. I'm convinced, however, that there's more to it, and that drawings such as this one in particular served a different purpose. They functioned as communicative tools, facilitating conversations about Tahitian life was at moments when words were insufficient, when there was a limited vocabulary. And that they were produced precisely around the same time that the map was produced. In July, August 1769, as Cook, Banks, and the ship's artist Sidney Parkinson began compiling their observations and synthesizing their knowledge from the past 2 months into their journals. And in doing so, they come up with these very detailed accounts. Their journals describe in remarkable detail warfare, canoe construction, navigation, ritual practice, social organization, and so on. Take warfare as an example. Cook and Banks provide extensive written descriptions of war canoes, their construction, their crews, their battle formations, despite never having seen any of these ships, any of these war canoes. Oh, and despite the fact that they did not see warfare. Nevertheless, Parkinson, for example, even produced a wash of one of them. This is what a war canoe looks like. So how is that possible? Towards the end of his long account on Tahitian warfare, Bank admits that his information came from description. He had not seen any of this. So yes, the knowledge was shared with him. It was explained. Oh, sorry. It was explained. Drawings, as you will guess from the way I'm setting up this talk, were central to that process of explanation. One of Tupaia's images, and I'm giving you now sort of a close-up of the one we've seen before, depicts twin-hulled war canoes engaged in battles, rendered with striking technical precision. There's a focus on how these canoes are built, right? Plank built. There are carved pillars supporting fighting platforms, weaponry in use, specific combat techniques, precisely the details that appear in Banks's and Cook's written accounts and that Parkinson reproduces visually. Cook would actually acknowledge that this information came from Tupaia and that it came to him via drawing on his second voyage, when he then finally does see war canoes. He says, you know, I've previously written about war canoes, and I did so on the basis of a drawing that Tupaia shared with us. So I've talked about this here to reconsider how knowledge was produced during European Tahitian encounters. What appears in the journal and what was long considered as resulting from empirical observation was in many cases actually mediated through Tupaia, and it was mediated through these drawings. And it was mediated, in the case of the map that I'm here to talk about, via the map as well. And I'll return to the map slowly now. With regard to the map, a crucial entry in Cook's journal from 15 August 1769 illustrates the crew's reliance on Tupaia's knowledge and remarkable trust, especially when it came to navigation placed on him. By this point, the Endeavour had left the Society Islands and was heading south. On that day, Tupaia intervened and suggested that they instead voyage westward to what we now know as Tonga. Cook records that these islands lay roughly 400 leagues west of iātea, and that according to Tupaia, they could be reached in 10 to 12 days, with a return voyage of around 30 days against the prevailing winds. And Cook then adds the rather striking remark, all this I believe to be true. I'm stressing that here because in the hundreds of years that were then to come, people did not believe this to be true. And people do not believe that Tupaia had this kind of knowledge. So Cook here in this particular moment stresses, all this I believe to be true. And there's more that's quite remarkable about this exchange. Let's maybe begin with the geographical claim. You don't really need to see much on this map that I'm now sharing. There's not much on it, actually. And that is to share the fact that Europeans, when this exchange happens, knew next to nothing about the wider sea of islands. Tupaia's professed knowledge therefore stood in striking contrast to what Cook himself understood of the Pacific at that moment. This is a map by the master's mate of the Endeavour, Richard Pickersgill, that must have been drawn in that very moment, around August 15. And we know this because at that point they anchor next to an island called Rawutu in the south of Tahiti. and you will not be able to read it, but next to that island, south of Tahiti, south of the Society Island, Pickersgill also notes, and I can't give you the exact wording right now because I forgot to write it down, but it says someone from Tahiti is telling us about more islands like that way. So it's the same conversation, but here rendered on the map. What's also sort of remarkable, at least in retrospect, I think, is that through Tupaia's teaching, Cook became the first European to grasp the broader pattern of settlement across Oceania, including the logic of sailing against the trade winds from west to east. Shortly afterwards, Cook would again reflect in his journal that these people, he says, sailed from island to island across several hundred leagues, navigating by the sun during the day and by the moon and stars at night. And we can see that in August 1769, there must have been a very intense phase of sustained exchanges with Tupaia because they're on board the ship. There's no one else whom they could have talked to about navigation. We believe that these entries sort of reflect conversations that took place with the help of Tupaia's map, a visual tool much like the drawings, and a visual tool that also, much like the drawings, did not follow Tahitian representational conventions. Rather, the map, like the drawings, was an act of translation, a Polynesian system of spatial knowledge rendered in a form that Cook and others could begin to understand. So how did Tupaia translate his understanding of space and navigation in space into the map? I want to begin with, and I hope you can just trust me on this, with a simple observation, because otherwise I'd be taking too long. We are certain that the map making began with someone, a crew member, setting up a cartographic framework based on what the Endeavour's crew knew, and really based on chart by Pickersgill that I've just shared. In that setup, we would have the cardinal axis, and we would have all the islands known to Europeans in that particular moment. So cardinal axis, islands that had been visited, and also a projection model, the Mercator model, in actually rendering them in space. And then they would have handed it to Tupaia and go, well, you've just told us there's so many more. Tell us where they are. And Tupaia agrees to share, but he does not follow the representational logic. Instead, he began to draw voyaging paths. So to explain a bit more what I mean by this is to say, we believe the map should not be understood as a representation of fixed island positions, but in line with Polynesian traditions of wayfinding and navigation that thinks about pathways, movements from island to island in a particular given sequence. And I would want to stress that in a society where knowledge is shared orally, these sequences, and we have some proof, would have been shared in form of chants learned by future navigators in voyaging schools. There was no written record in that sense, but rather repetition. You need to know first this island and then that island and so on and so on. Remarkably, the Endeavour journals actually record such chants in the form of island lists at several moments. And that is because Cook and other members of the crew were so interested, of course, in, where's land, where can we find more? And they would have asked people, and people would have then given them. And Tupaia in particular would have then shared these chants, which are called in the journals island lists. One such list, and you don't need to read this, I just want to sort of show the archival find. One such list, recorded by the Endeavour's master at the time, Robert Molyneux, appears to correspond rather directly with Tupaia's map. When we number, if you would number the sequence of islands that are seen here on the right-hand side, and compare these numbers with island names on the chart, you would find, first of all, that they more or less align, and that from this comparison, patterns begin to emerge. And not easy to find, but you would sort of see, I hope you can see it on your screens, that certainly, 8, 9, 10 are sort of in the same corner of the map, or 25, 26, 27 in the bottom left, for example, sort of seem to be sort of, they follow one after the other after the other. So that was, in a way, the first step of our deciphering, was to take these numbers and then play a connect the dots kind of game and see what emerges. And this is more or less what emerges if you do that. In the center, you would have the islands the Europeans had drawn, and around it are these sequences. But still, it's not clear yet what their logic is. How come these are in sequence? We found that an important clue lies in the word Tupaia requested to be written at the intersection of the cardinal axis, that is, in the center of the map. You'll see it here, there's sort of a ship shape, and then below it says iātea. Iātea in Tahitian means noon, or maybe the sun at noon, midday. Now that's a rather strange thing to write when you think about navigation, because as far as, and we've spoken with some navigators, the sun at noon is a rather unreliable tool for navigation. It's sort of right above you, and there's no direct, it doesn't really indicate much of a direction. And also it's hard to know when exactly noon is. There's sort of a longer window. As I shared earlier, in Polynesian navigation, it's mostly different categories of stars at night that determine direction, or at dusk and dawn. So we were puzzled by why Tupaia would put iātea, the sun at noon, in the center of his map. In European navigation, though, at the time, noon was crucial. As the late Greg Denning has argued, noon aboard a sailing ship, was a ritual. The day begins on board a ship to this day, I think, begins at midday. The vessel was brought to halt, the sailing ship. Instruments were carried on deck. Officers appear in full uniform, and the sun's highest point is measured to determine latitude and recalibrate the ship's instrument. By the time Tupaia creates this map, he had observed this ritual daily for weeks, because that's how long he had already been sailing with them. And we believe he recognized noon as a shared conceptual anchor, a translation device, if you like, between the navigational systems. By marking iātea, the sun at noon, at the center, he could align his relational voyaging knowledge with European directional expectations, creating a bridge between Polynesian and European ways of understanding space. How would he do that? Now, I'm glad I'm in the Southern Hemisphere, because this part is hard to explain to people in the Northern Hemisphere. But in the Southern Hemisphere, south, where we are right now, the sun at noon, of course, marks north. Not sort of all the way, but certainly is in the north. And Tupaia's stroke of genius was to override where we think on the map you'd find north on the map. That's gone. West, east, south, that's all gone. The fixed cardinal orientations. Instead, he placed north, iātea, at the center of the map, and abandoning, in that sense, the grid. From this point onward, every island he added was a center in its own right, according to Polynesian voyaging traditions, practice, a starting point from which a pahi, a voyaging canoe, could embark along a traditional sequence of islands, a voyaging path. And viewers are invited to abandon the bird's eye view's perspective and to situate themselves on that island, imagine themselves on that island. And from here, they take two bearings, one to the north, to the map center, and one to the island where they want to go to next. And the angle between the two sets the course. Don't worry if that was too quick, because I'll be repeating this with an example in a second. And I'll be doing this by talking about the very first path he enters on his map. And that is the course from Rurutu, the island where they are anchored on the August 15th, to Reivevei, an island that Tupaia was talking about on that day. Here on this map of the entire Pacific, I'm highlighting in green where that particular sequence is located. And now I'll return to Tupaia's map. This is where we are. Once Tupaia had placed Rurutu on the map, you'll see it here as O Rurutu, or being at the time was a word that was, the, or maybe so understood as the, but Rurutu being the name. And he would have then had to explain how to sail from there, from Rurutu to Reivevei. So we need to look at where he positioned Reivevei, here called Oreivevei, at the far left of that long line. That is the target island in relation to Rurutu, the point of departure. So I'll just repeat what I said before, but this time with an example. Tupaia would have invited cook and officers gathered in the great cabin to imagine themselves standing on the first island he had drawn, Rurutu. From there, they were to draw two imaginary lines, one to Reivevei, the island where they want to go, and one to the intersection of the cardinal axis to iātea, right, to north. And I've drawn both lines for you, the line to Reivevei in sort of a continued line, and the one to north, pointing north, going down on this map in a dotted line, right? So when you look at the angle between the two, you'd see it's sort of 100, I think I know it's 110 degrees because we measured, right? It's a bit more than 90. And when you go 110 degrees sort of around clockwise from north, you end up in an east-southeast direction. And that's exactly where on sort of a map that we can now read these days, that course is also, that's the course on the map. It sets an exact course for Reivevei. I hope that was fine. I can try and explain it again if that wasn't, but for now that's the best I can do. I will not take you through all of the voyaging paths that are on Tupaia's map. I'm sharing them here, translated into a Mercator projection. We have developed this in detail in our essay, but I would like to stress that the bearings between islands on Tupaia's map are often remarkably accurate, sometimes within just a few degrees of modern measurements. So Tupaia's map is internally consistent, it's systematic. It links the Society Islands to the Austral Islands, to Samoa, Tonga, Rarotonga, Puka Puka, the Marquesas, and even Hawaii. This does not mean that the map functions like a European navigational chart. Rather, it's a translated representation of a far more complex knowledge system. It compresses that complex system into a format that could be translated to Cook, and that could be grasped. It reflects at the same time what mattered within Tupaia's own sort of worldview. It's not a complete inventory of the Pacific. Quite strikingly, for example, Fiji is not on Tupaia's map, although we cannot imagine how he could have not known about it, but he's not sharing that particular space, maybe because he had no relationship with it. But he's sharing a network of meaningful inter-island relationships. Most importantly for, I think, my talk today, I would want to stress it can be understood, this map. It was created to be understood, and it can be understood. Now, as I draw towards the end of my talk, I want to return to the theme of encounters and ask why Tupaia chose to share his knowledge about navigation and religious expertise that was traditionally the preserve of his own sort of social group of Tahua navigators, very specialized knowledge. This is often explained in terms of a specific form of partnership, a tayo bond between Banks and Tupaia. And while that may have played a role, there's ample evidence, I think, that Tupaia shared this knowledge also with the hope of getting something back, of establishing, people have argued, a very concrete, actually military partnership against the island of Pora with the Endeavour's crew, right? He was exiled from his island because of that animosity with Pora and he talks a lot. When you look closely, he does talk a lot about war, and there are moments when he actually asks for assistance, for military assistance, and is not given it, right? So this intention to maybe give information but to get something back is recorded in the Endeavour journals and maps, and it's one of the messages, I think, encoded in Tupaia's drawing of the war canoes, for example. Cook, however, and others did not enter into this bargain, and I don't think they ever seriously considered this a possibility. As a result, the knowledge Tupaia provided was largely appropriated into the colonial archive without acknowledgement of its source, the context of the encounter in which it was offered, or the potential obligations it implied. And I'm asking myself where that leaves us in relation to this history today. The temporal distance might free researchers like myself and Lars Eckstein from certain obligations, such as declaring war on the people of Pora. That would simply be silly. However, mining the archive for this encounter history and for information about a culture and a place that is not our own, we feel produces other obligations that require attention. So I want to end by briefly sharing three examples of where this unease, this recognition of Tupaia's unacknowledged agency, has taken us individually and in collaboration with others. My examples are also maybe also a bit vain way of sharing what other work we are currently doing, or maybe just to share with you what we're currently doing. For Lars, it has meant to, in really amazing work, to reconstruct best he can what Tupaia's navigational practice must have been, and most recently, building on work he's done with anthropologist Mimi George, Lars has published on a wind compass, or more precisely on a wind positioning system, Rua Matahi, that Tupaia appears to have shared in the same session that the map was created. And Lars argues that the Rua Matahi provided navigators with a cognitive model for orientation that complemented the knowledge encoded in the map itself. So Lars's answer has been to never give up in trying to understand, no matter how hard and how sort of epistemologically challenging it might be. My own work has focused on Tupaia's drawings in the attempt to show how much of Tupaia's knowledge was appropriated by the Endeavour's officers, often without indication of the source, and I shared some of that work today. I'm also currently involved in bringing together a group of collaborators from Tahiti, Hawaii, and Germany to write about Tupaia's role in the creation of another map that was produced before Tupaia's famous map was done, and talk about Tupaia's role in the production of a Leeward Society Island chart during the weeks leading up to the creation of Tupaia's map. That was certainly a collaborative undertaking in the past and should, I think, also be talked about collaboratively in the present. However, Lars and I have both felt that this is somehow inadequate still, or this kind of scholarly engagement with the source. And I'm not saying that it's not good per se, but I'm sort of saying that for us it hasn't quite felt right. And so we also turn towards more practical collaborations, which I'm sure many of you do, but as literary scholars that we usually are, that was a huge thing for us to do, to actually talk with people. And in 2023, we were able to invite a group of navigators to Berlin to think with us about Polynesian wayfinding and to visit cultural belongings related to their own voyaging tradition held in Berlin's Ethnological Museum. Out of that meeting, a more sustained collaboration has emerged, and we've been able to support ongoing efforts to revive Polynesian voyaging traditions in Tamako, the Solomon Islands, and in Milne Bay, Papua New Guinea, with funding from Germany. So we're sort of just writing funding applications for this particular group of voyagers, and I want to really and with these images of new voyaging canoes that were built well, over the past 2 years and have begun to sail in this particular part of the Pacific again. So if Tupaia's map emerged from an encounter shaped by asymmetry and unrealized obligation, then perhaps I feel our task today is to approach that archive differently and to consider what it might mean to respond, albeit belatedly, to the generosity embedded in that act of translation. And that's it. And I want to thank you for listening to me today.
Thank you so much, Anja. That was absolutely fantastic. It's just really marvelous being able to see the maps in a very different way, a way quite unexpected. Absolutely wonderful. I open it up for everyone to ask questions. So please, if either put your hand up or make yourself known to me in some way that I can see it. One thing, I'm just going to take the chair's privilege and just very quickly ask. One thing that really, I mean, maybe the first time, I mean, I've read this work and I know this work well, but what really interested me was that Tupaia left out Fiji. That's fascinating.
Mm,
And if we think about, I'm thinking about some of the work Nick Thomas did, some of his earlier work where he was really talking about the incredibly arbitrary nature of what we call Melanesia versus
mhm.
Polynesia. And I mean, is Fiji invisible because it's in Melanesia, not Polynesia?
Hmm. I would not know. All we can say is he did not think because he must. It's so big. You cannot
No, you can't
cannot
miss
miss
Fiji.
it. Um. So you must have. It must have been a choice. And that is. I think we do think he knows more islands. He knows more split place, but he's sharing the ones that matter.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess it also would feel. Yeah. It would feel wrong if I then go, oh, maybe it's because of this genealogy. It's not my
Sure,
genealogy to say
sure.
it. Just to say this is the explanation I would have is that he knows of it and it's not the story he feels he's entitled to tell or he's interested in telling, so he doesn't tell it.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Fantastic.
it is quite it's quite funny.
Fascinating.
Can I
Completely.
if I can share among so the voyagers coming to Berlin, there was a Fijian navigator, the two, and he didn't mind us saying Tupai didn't recognize him, but what they all cared about was the Berlin Museum is famous for its canoes in the exhibition for the waka in the exhibition, and he was so proud of the Fijian
Yeah.
tour that was there. Um, and then others said, there was one from Tamako, and then there was one from the Marianas, but there was not one from this particular region. And that navigator went, how come I'm being left out? So it's sort of repeating itself even in the colonial museum. So, how come you're not talking about us? Sorry,
Yeah.
it's just an association. It was quite funny. It's like, I
No,
built one for you.
fascinating. I mean, I'm really going to age myself now, but it's over 30 years ago that Ian McNiven and I first visited the Berlin Museum.
Mm,
And at that stage, they actually had on display what was essentially, it was, we talk about these things as ships or sorry, as canoes or boats,
mm,
whatever. But this was a ship. I mean, it was a
mm.
ship. It was the biggest, most
Yeah,
extraordinary thing I'd ever
yeah.
seen. And I from memory, I think it was from the south coast of Papua or somewhere like that.
Mhm.
It was to do with that kind of amazing
Yeah, I know that one. Yeah,
it's
yeah.
so and the logistics of how they got it to Berlin just was sort of, mind-boggling because
Yeah,
it is,
that one, when you come, Lynette, we should go because that the provenance history of that one is the one incredibly clear case of colonial loot. And so that one's
excellent.
now
Well,
has a sign
you're
next to
on.
it where it goes, we
You're
should not
on.
have this. Whereas the others equally, I mean, but that one is so clear, the context of violence in which it was acquired.
Excellent. Well, not excellent, but it's very good that
No,
we get to
at
chat
least
about
the
it.
signs up, yeah. But
Yeah.
yeah, it's yeah. There's a lot to say, and I look forward to having you in Berlin to maybe visit the canoes together.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I can say we're also very excited about being in Berlin to do exactly that. Does anybody have a question? I can't see everybody, so I'm not entirely sure Let me just look if I can. Oh, I see. Do it like that. Okay. No, people are not. No one's put their hand up.
That is also fine.
Indeed, indeed. Look, it is always a challenge, isn't it, when people ask you to revisit something that you did a while ago. And oh, look, I do have a question. Before I launch on that, I'll go over. Ian McNiven has a question. So, Ian, do you want to put your camera on, please? There he is.
Hi, Ian.
Hi, Anja, how you going?
I'm good.
I
Are
think was
you?
it Leiden we were chatting?
I think it might
Yes,
have been, yeah.
I
yeah.
might have been Amsterdam, I think.
Amsterdam. Yeah, it was somewhere.
Somewhere it was a restaurant. Yeah. So yeah, thank you for your presentation on it. Yeah, wonderful work, and it made me think of some of the maps we have for Indigenous Australians on the coast, and there's ones that were drawn for Alfred Haddon in Torres Strait, which sort of match up with European maps, but sort of don't. And that's where that really interesting sort of dialogue sort of happens. But the one that I find the most challenging, the anthropologist Norman Tyndale, when he went to Bentic Island in the Gulf of Carpentaria, working with the Kai Belt, and he asked a young 21-year-old fella to draw Bentic Island, and Tyndale had already drawn it from an aerial photograph and did place names around the coast. And then he got this young fella to draw his idea of the island. He did a sort of an outline, put the same place names around the coast. And he said, what I'm doing is when you go to all those different places and go, in a sense, around the island, you're looking into the sea. The island surrounds the sea. Whereas Tyndale said, but doesn't the sea surround the island? And he said, no, the island surrounds the sea. So as you go
Mm-hmm.
around the island, you're going around
Yeah,
the
and a
water.
lake basically. Yeah.
Yes, which unfortunately Tyndale didn't really go into it enough. And subsequent anthropologists like Paul Membert have tried to sort of understand it, but clearly it would take a lot more sort of work with the community and get into some pretty heavy duty ontology, I think, to try and sort of work out how that's happening. But yeah, just a fundamentally different way
Mhm.
of representing the world. So,
Yeah.
and then something like that, yeah, yeah, it is actually beyond my comprehension. I don't understand
Mhm.
that.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. I only have it's a comment, right? So, but it makes me, so I don't have an answer, but an association. Mm, I guess what I wanted to stress again was that what Tupaia shared is not his worldview, but the translation already. It's he's already moving, going halfway so that it's easier.
mm,
And I think that to me is important to stress. Yeah. Just but but there's sometimes, and that Lars is more confident in doing that kind of work. And I'm saying, no, I can go further and actually really, really try to get to the other, to sort of that big ontological
yeah,
shift. And I guess I'm just a, different person. I'm very shy of doing that kind of thing.
mm,
But yeah, that's my response. Sorry, it's half
yeah.
cooked.
I didn't expect to have an answer because, yeah,
No,
I don't
yeah,
think one
thanks for
exists at the
sharing that.
moment. Yeah.
I see
Yeah.
Penny has her hand up. Pen, you there? Hi. So lovely to see you. You're on mute.
Oh, thank you, Anja. That was
Hey.
wonderful. I haven't read your article, but yes, I'm very blown away by I guess, the sort of ethnographic spatiality work that you've done and Tupaia's spatial vision. So I knew a little bit about it, but not the detail. And yeah, I did want to ask a bit more about the voyaging pathways because they're so crucial to the way the map is spatially constructed from what you speculate is Tupaia's
Yeah.
oceanic sort of view. And are those voyaging pathways, I imagine they have been reworked and do they still exist? And are there other sources
Mm-hmm.
contemporaneous or after
Yeah.
Tupaia
Yeah.
to tell us more about those forging pathways which
Yes.
are so key to
Mm.
travel?
Mm. Yeah. So in the article is terribly long, and that's why I'm not expecting anyone to read it, but it is so long because we sort of went two ways, right? We looked at the numbers in the sequence, and then we also looked at other records that would maybe back it up.
Mm.
And we're trying to be very clear about when we think there's in other evidence too to suggest that this is a particular pathway. That's sort of that answer. I find sort of interestingly or enough is the fact that the one from the Marquesas to Hawaii, that is the longest distance. It is on the first, it has almost the best angle, right? The kind of direction is perfect. And also there's very strong evidence in chant that is was written down and sort of has the sequence also in the chant to say, yeah, that did exist. And that is so fascinating because it's at the same time clear that that particular path had not been, sailed for a long time, like
Yes.
generations, and it was still like so stable in its representation and also stable in the chanting. So that's sort of the one response. And the other one, I heard you have sort of comment on the fact that, or at least I would want to talk about the fact that it's something that Mimi George would stress a lot also is that colonization and nation states, of course, have, and lots of other things have meant that this is that this is not being sailed or has not been sailed
Yes.
for a long time.
Yes.
And part, at least for the people in Tamako who are now building these vessels again, it's partly to go along, do some of that again. And it's quite practical. Actually, it sort of started the efforts or the renewed efforts started after the pandemic and after the experience that an island like Tamako was not visited by any supply ship then for 6 months, right? You could not get people to hospital, you could not get food. And in moments of breakdown, these kinds of it might be quite good to reopen some of them, and that's the sort of the efforts. Some of these connections need to be sailed again, maybe by other means culturally to keep culture alive, but also quite pragmatically. And I love that kind of need, and I think that's important to stress this need in the present also for there to be that kind of practice again.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Yes.
2 half answers.
Thank you so
Read
much.
the article.
Thank
The
you
other-
so much. We are drawing to a close. David will just pop up our final slide for the night. Our next seminar, which is on the 19th of March, it's not very far away. There's actually, David's put the link there in the chat if anybody needs to do that. That'll be Natalie Pearson, who's going to be talking on maritime encounters, the Balatung shipwreck, and its many afterlives. And if the Balatung shipwreck is a remarkable shipwreck, and it's just a really wonderful story that Natalie has woven around that. Just to remind you, anybody who might be going to Perth between the 6th of February and the 29th of March, our exhibition, Awakening Histories, is on at the Perth Institute for Contemporary Art, PICA. On the 16th of March, we are still to be determined but to be confirmed for our speaker for our session. On the 14th to the 17th of May, Global Encounters is heading back to Macassar for the International Writers Festival, and we'll be presenting our research to our colleagues in Macassar and gifting a series of historical images to the museum there. And we are planning on filming as much of that as we can. Just to keep you in the loop, we are setting up a YouTube videos channel, and all of the Global Encounters seminars will eventually end up there. And hopefully that'll be a nice lasting legacy of this project. So Anja, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. I really do appreciate you doing this for us. And I'm sure you're very jet lagged because you were jet lagged yesterday. So I'm sure you're extra jet lagged now. So
It's been wonderful to be able to do this. Thank you.
That's okay. I
Thank you
will
so
see you
much,
tomorrow
Anja.
afternoon. I'm seeing you tomorrow afternoon.
Yeah.
But thank you. And thank you, everybody, for joining us tonight. And see you in the next seminar. Bye.